I just lost my place. Oh, here we go. Okay. So we are going to be looking down. Well, that kind of involves the proxy. I guess I should talk about that part first. Okay. So before I get to the actual proxy, now we're going to handle that button click, what actually happened there. Any questions about the gist of this markup? Okay, so then the last thing we have to look at then is what happens when I click that button, right? And that's where we're going to actually have like real click event that we're going to handle right here, right? So just like when you're working with any kind of a client that talks to an XML web service, when you are working with a client that talks to a WCF service, your first job is to build a proxy, right? Unless you want to write thousands of lines of grungy code, so we want to get a proxy. So all we got to do is we just right-click and say Add Service Reference. And we just point to the endpoint, and Visual Studio generates a proxy, right? So my proxy is called Circo Info Client, right? That proxy is going to automatically have support for synchronous and asynchronous calls, right? So remember how my WCF contract had one method called getData, right? So I got a method called getData, or an event called getData completed, right? So I'm going to make the proxy, and I tell this proxy, oh, by the way, when you call this method, and you're all done, right, call me back over here on my proxy. Right? So now we're back in the actual user control. So we're just going to do an asynchronous call. Right? And this is how I actually do it. So there's the name of the actual method, getData asynchronously. Okay? So I click the button. That remote method is called, which eventually calls the handler down here. And this is the part I was trying to get to. See this line of code right here? There's the name of my grid. Items source. Meaning, where are you getting the data? Right? Well, I'm getting it from this. Okay, look at this. Get data completed event args. So guess what is inside of this result? Yeah, the array of circle infos. And what am I going to do? I'm going to slap it on my grid. Right? And then what does the grid do with that information? Yeah, it's going to display it all. Right? And then here, this was not mandatory, but being kind of lazy. If I didn't do that, I'd see the message in two places because I didn't make a really custom template. I just made a quick template. So I'm just going to programmatically get rid of that. Right? So I don't see like redundant messages. Right? But then again, when we kind of look at this whole thing working in this whole entire control, pretty sweet. Right? To have this level of functionality using an object model and a programming language that we already feel comfortable with, right? And essentially programming kind of a micro CLR. So before we look at the web page that hosts these suckers, any question about this little Silverlight plugin? That was just binding it to that is new property. Yeah, as long as the browser is hosting that page, you're alive in that browser memory space.
So if your circle class contained information about the animation, you could programmatically add them onto that instead of parsing it?
Yeah. And remember, if you have to persist things beyond current session, we can use things like isolated storage.
Can you store them off canvas and then call them into the right space, or can you actually programmatically create them?
You can programmatically create them too. Absolutely.
And if you were in that C# in the event handling, could you debug in there? Could you put a debug spot?
Yeah.
Would it actually stop I forget what you called it, the timeline or?
Oh, the storyboard? That's a little tougher because you can't really debug through XAML. But if you actually wrote all the code to do that, you could step through it. Yeah. And remember too now, these plugins, they're plugins, right? So some of the things that you would expect to have happen don't happen, that you would find in a WPF program. Like I'm trying to select the button on the designer, And notice how the property window is always blank, right? If this was a WPF demo, I could click on this kind of stuff here and then see this update with all my properties for what I just selected. Okay, so eventually I'm sure when Silverlight 2.0 is officially done, they'll probably have new official templates that'll be a lot cleaner than what we have today. Yeah, one more question.
Yeah, is there any sort of attributes or is there any sort of AOP stuff that would keep your code clean but then fire off events about like what's happening in your little plugin? If I want to, let's say I make a map and I want to know how many times people click on North America, are there little events that are logging those things out as events for click events? Any sort of, like IS log or anything like that?
No, nothing natively. You'd have to do that kind of stuff yourself. Yeah. No problem. Well, let's go ahead and get to the last part here. Then we should probably wrap her up. Let me just go back to the slide deck real quick. So again, I could have hit that same endpoint in a different browser, and I'd be good to go. And that's the other thing which is easy to forget, but that's a big piece, right? We could have written the same thing using, goodness forbid, an ActiveX control, but then we're totally locked into very specific browsers in the Windows operating system, right? Same thing in a Silverlight control. Now we have, real support for multiple operating systems and real support for different browsers.